Imagine being crowned Queen of England as a teenager, only to have your throne stolen by your own cousin, your marriage destroyed by political manipulation, and your life ended by torture in the Tower of London. Picture being so thoroughly erased from history that even your grave remained unmarked for centuries, your name becoming synonymous with treason rather than the royal blood that once made you England's rightful queen. This is the tragic story of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen whose brief reign became one of history's most heartbreaking examples of how innocent teenagers can become pawns in the deadly game of Tudor politics. What happened to Jane wasn't just murder. It was the systematic destruction of a brilliant young woman whose only crime was being born into a family, ambitious enough to challenge the most dangerous dynasty in English history. Before we uncover the tragic fate of England's most forgotten queen, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Jane Grey's story reveals how quickly royal power can become a death sentence in Tudor England. Lady Jane Grey never wanted to be Queen of England, but at 16 years old, she found herself at the center of the most audacious power grab in Tudor history, manipulated by adults who saw her royal blood as a ticket to unlimited power and wealth. Born in 1537 to Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and Lady Frances Brandon, Jane was Henry VIII's great niece and possessed a legitimate claim to the English throne that made her both valuable and dangerous in the volatile world of 16th century politics. Jane's childhood was defined by an education that was extraordinary even by Renaissance standards, but which came at the cost of any normal family relationships or personal freedom. Her parents, particularly her ambitious mother Frances, saw Jane's intellectual gifts as political assets rather than personal accomplishments. By age 9, Jane could speak fluent Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, debate theological concepts with adult scholars, and write sophisticated political treatises that impressed the most learned men in Europe. The young Lady Jane's daily routine was rigidly controlled by tutors and parents who believed that every moment not spent in study was wasted time that could have been used to enhance her political value. She woke before dawn for Latin prayers, spent her mornings translating classical texts, her afternoons studying theology and philosophy, and her evenings writing letters in multiple languages to foreign scholars and political figures. This intellectual intensity left little room for the play, friendship, and emotional development that normal children required. Jane's relationship with her parents was characterized by emotional coldness and physical punishment that bordered on abuse. When she failed to meet their impossibly high academic standards or showed any signs of independence, she was beaten, starved, and emotionally manipulated until she submitted to their will. Her mother Frances was particularly cruel, seeing Jane as a reflection of her own frustrated political ambitions rather than as a daughter deserving of love and protection. The death of King Edward VI in July 1553 created the opportunity that Jane's family had been waiting for their entire lives. Edward, influenced by his Protestant advisors and his own desire to prevent Catholic Mary Tudor from taking the throne, had changed the succession to exclude his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey. This decision, while legally questionable, gave Jane's supporters the justification they needed to proclaim her Queen of England. Jane's reaction to learning of her elevation to the throne revealed the fundamental tragedy of her situation. She was horrified rather than honored by the news. When informed that she was now Queen of England, Jane reportedly fainted and had to be revived with smelling salts. Upon regaining consciousness, she begged to be released from this responsibility, saying that she was unworthy and that the crown rightfully belonged to Mary Tudor. Her pleas were ignored by the adults who had orchestrated her coronation, including her own parents, her new father-in-law, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and the Protestant nobles who saw her as their only hope for maintaining their religious reforms and political power. Jane was forced to accept the crown she didn't want, beginning a 9-day reign that would end with her imprisonment, torture, and eventual execution by the woman she had tried to refuse to replace. Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign as Queen of England was a political disaster that transformed her from reluctant monarch into condemned traitor, as the English people rejected her questionable claim to the throne and rallied behind Mary Tudor's more legitimate right to rule. From July 10 to July 19, 1553, Jane found herself trapped in the Tower of London, not as a prisoner, but as a queen whose authority was crumbling with each passing hour. The Tower of London, which served as both royal palace and state prison, became Jane's gilded cage during her brief reign. While she occupied the royal apartments and was attended by servants and courtiers, she was essentially a prisoner of the men who had placed her on the throne. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, controlled access to the young queen and made all real decisions while maintaining the fiction that Jane ruled in her own right. Jane's attempts to exercise genuine royal authority revealed both her intelligence and her political naivete. When Northumberland pressured her to make her husband Guilford Dudley king, rather than just prince consort, Jane refused, demonstrating a surprising understanding of constitutional law that impressed even her enemies. She insisted that she had been made queen by Parliament and Council, and only they could elevate her husband's status. This defiance angered Northumberland and created tensions within Jane's own support network. Meanwhile, Mary Tudor was gathering support throughout England with remarkable speed and effectiveness. The English people, regardless of their religious preferences, recognized Mary as Henry VIII's legitimate daughter and heir, while Jane was seen as a usurper imposed by ambitious nobles seeking to maintain their power. County after county declared for Mary, and even some of Jane's initial supporters began switching sides as it became clear which way the political winds were blowing. The psychological pressure on Jane during these 9 days was enormous. At 16, she was trying to navigate the most complex political crisis in English history while being manipulated by adults who saw her only as a tool for their own advancement. She received reports of Mary's growing support, witnessed the desertion of her own supporters, and understood that her position was becoming increasingly hopeless with each passing day. Jane's Protestant faith provided her only real comfort during this terrifying period. She spent hours in prayer, reading scripture, and seeking divine guidance for decisions that could affect the future of English Christianity. Her religious convictions were genuine and deep, unlike the political calculations that motivated most of her adult supporters, and she saw her brief reign as a potential opportunity to advance Protestant reforms rather than personal power. The collapse of Jane's reign came with stunning swiftness. On July 19th, Northumberland's attempts to capture Mary failed catastrophically, and the Privy Council abandoned Jane in favor of the woman they now recognized as the rightful queen. Jane was informed that her reign was over and that she was now a prisoner in the same tower rooms where she had briefly been queen. Jane's reaction to her deposition was reportedly one of relief rather than disappointment. She had never wanted the crown and was glad to be free of the responsibility that had been forced upon her. However, her relief was premature. Being an ex-queen in Tudor England was far more dangerous than being a reluctant monarch. Lady Jane Grey's transformation from reluctant queen to condemned prisoner revealed the brutal realities of Tudor justice as she found herself trapped in the Tower of London, while Queen Mary Tudor's government decided whether mercy or execution would better serve their political needs. The same rooms that had briefly housed her as monarch now became her prison cell, a constant reminder of how quickly royal power could become a death sentence in 16th century England. Initially, Mary Tudor showed remarkable restraint toward her teenage cousin, recognizing that Jane had been manipulated by adults and had never truly desired the throne. Jane was allowed to keep servants, receive visitors, and maintain some dignity despite her imprisonment. She spent her days reading religious texts, writing letters to family members, and engaging in theological discussions with scholars who were permitted to visit her cell. However, Jane's comfortable imprisonment became increasingly precarious as political pressures mounted on Queen Mary's government. Foreign ambassadors warned that leaving Jane alive created opportunities for Protestant conspiracies, while Mary's own advisors argued that executing a 16-year-old girl would generate sympathy for Protestant causes and potentially trigger rebellions. Jane became a political problem that had no easy solution. The turning point came in early 1554. With Wyatt's Rebellion, a Protestant uprising led by Sir Thomas Wyatt that aimed to prevent Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain and potentially restore Jane to the throne. Although Jane had no knowledge of or involvement in the conspiracy, her very existence as an alternative monarch made her complicit in the eyes of Mary's government. The rebellion's failure sealed Jane's fate and transformed her from political prisoner to condemned traitor. Jane's living conditions in the Tower deteriorated dramatically following the rebellion's collapse. Her servants were dismissed, her visitors restricted, and her comfortable quarters replaced with a smaller, more austere cell that reflected her new status as a condemned criminal. The psychological torture of uncertainty was perhaps worse than physical deprivation. Jane never knew from day to day whether she would be executed or reprieved. The interrogations that followed Wyatt's rebellion were designed to extract a confession from Jane that would justify her execution and implicate other potential conspirators. Royal commissioners visited her cell repeatedly, attempting to convince her to admit guilt for treason she had never committed and to name other Protestants who might be plotting against Mary's government. Jane's responses showed remarkable courage and intelligence for someone so young. She consistently denied any involvement in conspiracies while defending her Protestant faith. Perhaps most cruelly, Jane was forced to witness the execution of her husband Guilford Dudley from her tower window on February 12, 1554. The young man she had married reluctantly became another victim of the political machinations that had doomed them both. Jane watched as his headless body was carried past her window in a cart, a deliberate psychological torture designed to break her spirit before her own execution. The final weeks of Jane's life were marked by intense pressure from Catholic priests who attempted to convert her to Catholicism in exchange for possible mercy. These theological debates became Jane's last opportunity to demonstrate the intellectual brilliance that had once made her famous throughout Europe. As she defended Protestant doctrine with a sophistication that impressed even her Catholic interrogators, while refusing to compromise her religious principles for the possibility of saving her life. Lady Jane Grey's execution on February 12, 1554, was designed to be both a public demonstration of royal justice and a private tragedy that would minimize sympathy for the Protestant cause, but instead became one of the most moving displays of courage and dignity in English history. At 17 years old, Jane faced death with a composure that impressed even her enemies and transformed her from failed usurper into Protestant martyr. The scaffold erected on Tower Green was deliberately modest compared to the elaborate public executions typically held at Tower Hill. Queen Mary's government wanted Jane's death to be witnessed by a select group of officials rather than the large crowds that might turn her execution into a Protestant rally. The intimate setting meant that every word Jane spoke and every gesture she made would be carefully observed and recorded by witnesses whose accounts would shape her historical legacy. Jane's final speech from the scaffold revealed the intellectual and spiritual strength that had sustained her throughout her imprisonment. She acknowledged that her acceptance of the crown had been legally treasonous, while maintaining that she had never desired royal power and had been manipulated by others into accepting a responsibility she had tried to refuse. Her words were carefully chosen to avoid implicating her surviving family members while taking personal responsibility for her fate. The most remarkable aspect of Jane's final moments was her insistence on maintaining the religious principles that had defined her life, even when conversion to Catholicism might have saved her. She used her scaffold speech to defend Protestant theology and express her certainty that her death would reunite her with God in heaven. Her religious conviction transformed what was supposed to be a humiliating public execution into a powerful testimony of faith that inspired other Protestants throughout England. Jane's composure during the actual execution process was extraordinary for someone so young. She submitted to having her eyes blindfolded, knelt at the block with perfect dignity, and placed her head in position for the executioner's axe with steady hands. Her final words, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," echoed Christ's last words and reinforced the religious meaning she had given to her death. The execution itself was swift and professional. A single stroke of the axe severed Jane's head cleanly, ending the life of someone who had been Queen of England for 9 days and a prisoner for 7 months. Her death eliminated the last serious Protestant claimant to Mary's throne and allowed the Catholic restoration to proceed without the constant threat of Jane being used as a rallying point for religious opposition. Perhaps most tragically, Jane's burial reflected the complete political erasure that Mary's government sought to impose on her memory. She was interred in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London, but unlike other royal prisoners executed there, Jane's grave remained unmarked for centuries. No headstone, no inscription, no acknowledgement that the body buried there had once worn the crown of England. The unmarked grave was a deliberate attempt to erase Jane from history, to ensure that future generations would not be able to venerate her as a Protestant martyr or remember her as England's forgotten queen. However, this effort to destroy her memory ultimately failed. Jane's dignity in death. Her intellectual brilliance and her tragic fate as a teenage victim of adult political ambitions made her story too compelling to forget. The next time you think being young means being safe from the consequences of adult ambitions, remember Lady Jane Grey, a brilliant teenager who was crowned at 16, condemned at 17, and forgotten for centuries. Her story reminds us that in the game of power, innocence is no protection and intelligence can become a liability. If this tragic tale of England's forgotten queen moved you, smash that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories of royal victims, and hit that notification bell, because the most important historical lessons often come from those who were written out of the official story. What other young rulers do you think were unfairly destroyed by adult political games? Share your thoughts in the comments below.